Welcome to Chapter 2, Session 10b of Tune In Tuesday, Old Testament History. We now are going to witness the blessings of God in action. Jacob had just left home to escape from his angry brother, who was planning to murder him after their father Isaac died. But his mother Rebekah intervened again and arranged for him to leave for the purpose of obtaining a wife. Without him around, Esau's anger probably assuaged. Then, on the way north to his relative's land, God spoke to him and confirmed the covenant and the promise made to his grandfather Abraham and to his father Isaac. He now strode forward, confident of God's blessing, intending upon finding a wife and returning home in peace. He will do that one day, but it will be 20 years in the future. Look at Genesis 29, verse 1. Genesis 29, verse 1. Then Jacob went on his journey and came into the land of the people of the east. And he looked, and behold, a well in the field, and lo, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it, for out of that well they watered the flocks. And a great stone was upon the well's mouth, and thither were all the flocks gathered, and they rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the sheep, and put the stone again upon the well's mouth in its place. And Jacob said to them, My brethren, whence be ye? And they said, Of Haran are we. So they had come south to take care of the sheep. And he said to them, Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. Ha! So the blessing of the Lord was immediately seen, because he had traveled about 500 miles north. And immediately he found a well, and the men there knew his relative Laban. How about that? Now we read again, Genesis 29, verse 6. And he said to them, Is he well? And they said, He is well. And behold, Rachel his daughter comes with the sheep. And he said, Lo, it is yet high day, neither is it time that the cattle should be gathered together. Water ye the sheep, and go and feed them. We can until all the flocks be gathered together, until they roll the stone from the well's mouth, when we water the sheep. And while he yet spake with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she kept them. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban his mother's brother, that Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the flock of Laban his mother's brother. And Jacob kissed Rachel, and lifted up his voice, and wept. And Jacob told Rachel that he was her father's brother, and that he was Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father. Now, her father's brother, that means the word brother is relative. All right? And it came to pass, when Laban heard the tidings of Jacob his sister's son, that he ran to meet him. And Laban embraced him and kissed him, and brought him to his house. And he told Laban all these things. And Laban said, Surely thou art my bone and my flesh. And he abode with him about the space of a month. Well, Jacob couldn't go home until he had a wife. And guess what? Wow. The first woman he sees is beautiful, and she's going to be his wife. God doesn't mess around. But he had nothing for a dowry, so he would have to serve her father for a period of time in order to marry his daughter. Genesis 29, verse 15. And Laban said to Jacob, Because thou art my brother, shouldest thou therefore serve me for naught? Tell me, what shall your wages be? And Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah was tender-eyed, but Rachel was va-va-voom, beautiful and well-favored. Woo! And Jacob loved Rachel and said, I will serve thee 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. And Laban said, well, it's better that I give her to you than that I should give her to another man. Abide with me. So Rachel was his cousin, but that was okay to them. They were a match made in heaven. Verse 20. And Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed to him but a few days for the love that he had to her. How wonderful. And Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go in unto her. And Laban gathered together all the men in the place, made a feast. Came to pass in the evening, in the dark, he took Leah his daughter, and brought her to him, and he went in unto her in the dark. And Laban gave unto his daughter Leah Zilpah, his maid, for an handmaid. And it came to pass that in the morning, behold, it was Leah. And he said to Laban, what is this that you've done to me? Didn't I serve you for Rachel? Wherefore then have you beguiled me? And Laban said, it must not be done so in our country, to give the younger before the firstborn. Yeah, right. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also for the service, which thou shalt serve me yet another 7 years. And Jacob did so and fulfilled her week, and then he gave him Rachel, his daughter, to wife also. So now he has 2 wives, but he has to work 14 years. And Laban gave to Rachel, his daughter, Bilhah, his handmaid, to be her maid. So now we come to the origin of the tribes of Israel, or as my Old Testament mentor, John Chainhite, called it, the Baby Wars. This records the grand contest between Leah and Rachel for their husband's attention, but it also changed the world. Genesis 29, verse 30. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. And when the Lord saw Leah was hated, that means less loved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Now, of course, we have to understand this with the Hebrew idiom of permission. And Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben, which means, behold, a son. For she said, surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction. Now therefore my husband will love me. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he hath therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon, which means hearing. The Lord heard me. Verse 34, and she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I've borne him 3 sons. Therefore was his name called Levi, joiner. Verse 35, and she conceived again, and bare a son. And she said, now I will praise the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah, praise, and left bearing. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister, and said to Jacob, give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. He said, am I in God's place, who hath withheld thee from the fruit of the womb? But Rachel was desperate. She had no children. Of course, in that culture, if you didn't bear children, you were considered worthless. So she did what Sarah had done with Hagar. And she says, chapter 30, verse 3, behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, that I may also have children by her. So Bilhah was her slave, and so Rachel could claim the child as hers. Verse 4, and she gave him Bilhah her handmaid to wife, and Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son.
And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. Here come the judge. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali, which means wrestling. When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son, the fifth one. He had enough for a basketball team. And Leah said, troops coming! Or how fortunate that the word Gad can either mean troop or fortunate. So she called his name Gad. Of course, when he came out, she said, Gad! Or maybe she said, Gadzooks! I don't know. Verse 12. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And so she called his name Asher, happy. And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest, and found mandrakes in the field, an aphrodisiac, and brought them unto his mother Leah. And Rachel said to Leah, Give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she said unto her, Well, it is a small matter that thou hast taken my husband, and will you also take my son's mandrakes also? And Rachel said, Therefore he shall lie with me tonight for thy son's mandrakes. So they made a deal. And Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Rachel says, Guess what? Leah comes out to meet him and said, You must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with my son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. And God hearkened unto Leah, and she conceived, and bare Jacob the fifth son. And Leah said, God hath given me my hire, because I've given my maiden to my husband. And so she called his name Issachar, which means hired. And Leah conceived again, and bare Jacob the sixth son. And Leah said, God hath endued me with a good dowry. Now will my husband dwell with me, because I have borne him 6 sons. And she called his name Zebulun, dwelling. And afterwards she bare a daughter, called her name Dinah, avenged. Ooh. And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her, and opened her womb, and she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And so she called his name Joseph, which means increaser. And she said, The Lord will add to me another son. And it came to pass, when Rachel had borne Joseph, that Jacob said unto Laban, Send me away, that I may go unto mine own place, to my country. Wow. 11 sons and 1 daughter so far. What a family. It was the fulfillment of prophecy, and it would change the world. So now it's time to go back home. Genesis 30, verse 26. So he says, Give me my wives and my children, for whom I have served thee, and let me go, for thou knowest my service which I have done thee. And Laban says to him, I pray thee, if I have found favor in your eyes, tarry, stay here, for I have learned by experience that the Lord hath blessed me for your sake. Laban had seen that Jacob was blessed, and the Lord had prospered him, and by proxy, he'd bless Laban too. He saw a good thing and wanted to keep it going. Of course, we've seen that too with us. How many times to bless us, God blesses the businesses where we work. He blesses our bosses that take good care of us, right? Verse 28. So he said, Appoint me my wages, and I will give it. And he said unto him, You know how I have served thee, and how thy cattle was with me, for it was little which thou hast before I came, and it is now increased to a multitude. So his flocks really grew with Jacob in charge. And the Lord has blessed thee since my coming. And now when shall I provide for mine own house also? And he said, what shall I give thee? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your flock. Here's what he proposes. I will pass through all your flock today, removing from thence all the speckled and spotted cattle, and all the brown cattle among the sheep, and the spotted and speckled among the goats. And of such shall be my hire. Verse 33, so shall my righteousness answer for me in time to come, when it shall come for my hire before thy face, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and brown among the sheep, that shall be counted stolen with me. And Laban said, woo, behold, I would that it might be according to thy word. He saw a great deal. So here's the deal. Jacob got all the inferior animals with the discolored wool, and Laban got the best. Now, many of the commentators promote the idea that Jacob was a conniver, a supplanter, and a cheat. But remember, the Bible says he was a plain man, Tom, a man of integrity. He just got that name by grabbing Esau's heel when he was born. Look at verse 33 again. It says, his righteousness will answer for him. Well, how can that be so if he's a cheat? All right? Now, what's going to happen with the animals did not happen by magic. Did he baffle him with science? Remember that song? Science! Da-da-da, da-da-da. She baffled me with science. No, there's still only one way that animals can get different colored fur. And what is that? Not magic markers. Genetics. Dominant and recessive genes. Now, Jacob did not know genetics, but God did. And guess what? He revealed something to Jacob. Look at Genesis 31. Later on, Jacob says what God showed him. And also God showed him how it would work. Genesis 31, verse 10. It came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up mine eyes and saw in a dream. Now that's that idiom, lift up thy eyes. It's to look believingly. It's to look expectantly. Well, isn't that what we do when we are in situations that we need to receive revelation? Don't we lift up our eyes, in a manner of speaking? Don't we look expectantly, expecting to receive, right? While he lifted up his eyes, saw in a dream, behold, the rams which leaped upon the cattle were ring-straked, speckled, and gristled. Well, that word leaped is not a good translation. It's Strong's number 5927. It means to climb. Brown Driver Briggs gives one of the meanings of, quote, cattle in a sexual act. Oh. Verse 11. That's what God showed him. And the angel of the God spake unto me in a dream, verse 11, saying, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said to me, lift up now your eyes and see. All the rams which leap, same word, climb, upon the cattle are ring-straked, speckled, and gristled. For I have seen all that Laban does unto thee. Because see, Laban had screwed him over. He worked 7 years expecting to receive a wife, and Laban connived him into working twice that amount. And now he proposes to Laban this deal, and Laban's going to mess him up too. So God says, I have seen all that Laban does unto thee. So Jacob received a vision from God showing him animals mating, right? They were climbing. Well, that's pretty descriptive of cattle mating, isn't it? But which ones were doing it? ring-streaked, speckled, and gristled. And God said, lift up now your eyes and see. That's the idiom. Look expectantly and see. I will show you. Show you what? Which males should mate. Okay, you farmers. When you have female cattle in heat, what do you do to make sure that they don't mate with the wrong males? What do? Well, you put them in a pen, and you only let the male you want in there with them. Is that right, you farmers? You 4-H folks? Well, what are pens made of? Fences. All right. Well, back then in ancient times, what were fences made of? Wooden poles. And if that is the case, then Jacob was practicing selective breeding, while Laban, we're going to see, was random breeding. So, do you think maybe what the text is trying to say something, but the translators screwed it up? I mean, those King James, Oxford, and Cambridge boys were never in 4-H. They thought it was magic. They thought what the animals looked at while mating had an effect. Nah. This is a passage of the Bible that critics make fun of, but one must understand that almost all of the initial translations of the Bible, of the world's major languages, were done before we understood genetics. Mendel's discoveries were in the 1850s. But he even had strong opposition then from competitors who thought that exposing seeds to the cold would produce hardier plants. No, only genetics can do that. In every language, words have more than one meaning, so it's often the case that passages can be interpreted in different ways. So I think the translators were barking up the wrong tree, pole. Genesis chapter 30, verse 35. And he, Laban, removed that day the he-goats that were ring-streaked and spotted, and all the she-goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had some white in it, and all the brown among the sheep, and gave them into the hand of his sons. And he set 3 days' journey betwixt himself, Laban, and Jacob. And Jacob fed the rest of Laban's flocks. So Laban thought he was really smart, because Jacob had made this proposal. Give me all the inferior sheep and all the inferior goats. So what Laban did immediately is he took all of them and took them away from Jacob, so Jacob couldn't use those goats and sheep as mating stock to give himself more of them. Laban thought he was doing himself a favor. He thought he was really smart. He thought he was really going to screw Jacob, and Jacob would be almost working for nothing. So he separated the flocks upon their coloring. Now, here is a quote from something on the internet named Jacob's Stick Trick or God's Wisdom by J. Wing. Quote, we now know white to be dominant in sheep, the dominant gene, and all black to be recessive, while Laban immediately yanked all spotted sheep, goats, and cows to not give any of those animals to Jacob. This means only that the cows and sheep of a solid color, like all white or all black, would have been left in Jacob's care. However, in his haste to cheat Jacob out of any pay, what Laban failed to realize was what we now know in genetics, that dominant traits can mask recessive traits of the speckled and streaks. Those are called heterozygous. So, if you have AA, double dominant, and AB, who are recessive carriers, and BB, double recessives, in any average group, you'll have 25% of each of the doubles, AA and BB, and 50% of the recessive carriers that have genes that are AB. All right? So this means that every single one of the speckled and spotted were completely recessive, BB. And Laban had simply removed all of the pure recessives, BB, from the herd and left Jacob with all the ones that only looked unspotted and unspeckled. Those were the AA, both dominant, and the AB that had a recessive that was masked with the dominant. But remember, 25% of the AAs, 25% of the BBs, and 50% of the ABs. So of that group that was left, the AAs and the ABs, 2/3 of them, of that herd, still carried that recessive trait of spotted and speckled, hidden by the dominant trait of all the same color. So the herds under Jacob's care still had the genes for speckled and streaked. Genesis 30, verse 37. Now, this is where all the commentators go crazy. There are so many different theories out there about this. It's funny. Genesis 30, verse 37. And Jacob took him rods of green poplar and of the hazel and chestnut tree, and stripped them, white strakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods. That's Strong's number 4731. A rod, a staff, or a pole. Okay? Verse 38. And he set, that's Strong's number 3322. Set up, that means to be stayed or stopped. And it is even used of herds, animal herds, in Exodus 10:24 as detained. So he used these poles. He set up something that detained the rods, the poles, which he had stripped before the flocks in the gutters. Now, gutters, Strong's number 7298. We'll talk about that in a little bit. In or by the watering troughs. That's Strong's number 8268. The watering troughs are irrigating canals. Strong's number 8268. When the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. So, Jacob used wooden branches and stripped the bark off of them. Now, what did he do with those rods or poles? I think he made fences out of them. The vision must have told him to strip the bark. Now, how can I say that? Well, here's the clue. And you know what's crazy? I believe God told me what to look for even before I took a closer look at Genesis 30 and before I even opened up Brown Driver and Briggs. It's a word with a double meaning. He told me to look for a word with a double meaning. And here's that clue. King James says that in verse 38, he set the rods in the gutters, in the watering troughs. Now, some commentators think he made bark tea that had strange chemicals in it. Da-da-da, da-da-da. Baffled him with science. No, wait a minute. Why does it seem to be doubled there? In a gutter, in a trough? That's strange, isn't it? But there's another meaning for the word gutter. Strong's number 7298, rahat. Brown Driver Briggs says it can mean collected. Bingo. That's what a fence can do, right? With a herd of animals. So I think what it was saying that the translators couldn't fathom, because none of them had been in 4-H, so they translated it like it was done by magic, not by science. Da-da-da, da-da-da. God baffled them with science. Instead, Jacob set up fences by the irrigation canals where they watered the flock to collect the females in heat and only let the males that God showed him by revelation to mate with them the ones that had the right genes. And when they were stuck in between the fences, they mated with them. God showed him which solid-colored ones had the recessive gene AB. And then the AA, solid-colored males, were not permitted to mate. So what will that produce? Genetics, my dear Watson, genetics, not magic. It'll produce more ring-streaked, speckled, and gristled, double recessive offspring. So, should we recognize Jacob as the father of genetics? Mendeleehi who? Who dat? Hallelujah, sock it to you. Mendel figured out why dominant and recessive genes work, but Jacob didn't need to know that. God didn't tell him science. He just told him what to do. And then Joshua said to Laban, na 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 na. Because Laban was the one cheating. Won't Nelly? Genesis 30, verse 39. And the flocks conceived before or beside, by the rods, the fence poles, and brought forth cattle, ring-streaked, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring-streaked, and all the brown of the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not unto Laban's cattle. So he separated out the discolored lambs, put them in his own flocks, and they reached puberty between 5 and 12 months, and then they were able to mate again. So many were able to mate by late fall. Genesis 30, verse 41. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid, or set in place, put together, collected the rods, the fence poles, before the eyes of the cattle in the gutters, the collectors, that they might conceive by or within the rods, the fence poles. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's. Put them not in where? Not in the enclosures, the collectors, the pens that were constructed with the fence poles by the watering ditches. There you got it. Rotherham's translation puts late in bearing in place of feeble. Now, you 4-H folks know that spring-born lambs reach puberty earlier than fall-born ones due to the fact that they can eat more in the summer and will have a better body weight, so they're able to bear sooner. So, even more sheep can be born sooner by the earlier bearing ones. By separating the early born and the late born and controlling which males got to mate, which was shown to Jacob in the vision, Jacob's herds got larger and larger. He didn't need to know why, which is what Mendel figured out 3,700 years later. He just did what God said. Now, that would be a good science project for somebody in 4-H, to chart it all out with dominance and recessives. Now, and I'm not even dealing with twinning sheep. Wasn't mentioned. Wow. Verse 43. And the man increased exceedingly, and had much cattle, and maidservants, and menservants, and camels, and asses. And he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that our fathers had, and of that which was our fathers hath he gotten all this glory. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and said, Behold, it was not toward him as before. And the Lord said to Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers, and into thy kindred, and I will be with thee. So he gets revelation. All right, it's time to leave. And Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field unto his flock. And he said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not toward me as before. But the God of my father has been with me, and you know that with all my power I have served your father, Laban, and your father, Laban, hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times. But God allowed him not to hurt me. So who's the cheater? Laban. Laban had changed the deal 10 times. If he said thus, the speckled shall be thy wages. Then all the cattle bear speckled. And if he said thus, the ringstraked shall be your hire, then bear all the cattle ringstraked. Why? How'd that work? Because God showed him which males to select for the breeding stock. Okay? Lift up your eyes and see. Okay? So God showed him. When Laban changed the deal to be only spotted, then God showed Jacob which solid colored males had the spotted gene recessive, and he put them in the pens. When Laban changed the deal again and said, oh, you're getting too many spotted, okay, now you can only have striped. So then God showed Jacob which solid colored males had the recessive striped, and so more striped were produced. That's the only variable in this whole scenario. Because if it was something in the chemicals that were made by the bark in some tea or whatever that some people think chemically caused them to somehow favor some genes to work or whatever, well, wait a minute, that remained the same throughout. What changed was the breeding stock that God showed Jacob, which males to let in. Verse 9, thus God has taken away all the cattle of your father and given them to me. And it came to pass at the time that the cattle conceived, that I lifted up mine eyes, and I saw in a dream, and behold, the rams which mated, who climbed upon the cattle, were ring-streaked and speckled and gristled. I mean, they looked solid color, but God showed me they were ring-streaked, speckled, and gristled. And the angel of God spake unto me in a dream, saying, Jacob, here I am. And he said, lift up your eyes and see. Believe to get revelation. All the rams which climb upon the cattle are ring-streaked, speckled, and gristled. For I have seen all that Laban doeth unto thee. Well, they looked solid colored, but the angel said, no, they're really this way. So did Jacob cheat Laban? No. Laban was cheating Jacob. Furthermore, Jacob did not know why the process produced discolored cattle. He wasn't privy to those details. He just did what God showed him to do, and it neutralized Laban's treachery, for Laban had changed his wages 10 times. So who's the crook? Jacob was innocent in the whole matter. Wow. There you have it. Genesis 31, verse 13. I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, where thou vowest a vow unto me. God says, arise, get thee out from this land, and return to the land of your kindred. So God gave the go sign to go home. Verse 14. And Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? So even Rachel and Leah were fed up. Are we not counted of him strangers? For he hath sold us, and hath quite devoured also our money. So Laban even cheated his daughters. For all the riches which God has taken from our father, that is ours and our children's. Now then, whatsoever God has said to you, do. We're all with you. So Jacob rose up, set his son and his wife upon camels. He carried away all his cattle, all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Padan Aram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. Verse 19. And Laban went out to shear his sheep. That's springtime. And Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. Ooh. And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he had told him not that he had fled. So he fled with all he had, and he rose up, passed over the river, set his face toward the Mount Gilead. And it was told Laban on the 3rd day, Jacob's fled. And he took his brethren with him and pursued after him 7 days' journey. And they overtook him in the Mount Gilead, about halfway home. And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said, you better take heed that you don't speak to Jacob either good or bad. Well, that took the wind out of his sails, didn't it? And then Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mount, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, what have you done, that you've stolen away, unaware to me, and carried away my daughters as captives, taken with the sword? Well, did he do that? No. Wherefore didst thou flee away secretly, and steal away from me, and didn't tell me, that I might have sent thee away with mirth, and with songs, and with tabret, and with harp? Yeah, right. And hast not allowed me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Thou hast now done foolishly in so doing. Well, God told him to do it. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt, but the God of your father spake to me last night, saying, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. And now though thou wouldst needs be gone, because thou sorest longest after thy father's house, yet wherefore have you stolen my stuff? You've stolen my gods. And Jacob answered and said, Laban, because I was afraid, for I said, peradventure thou wouldst take by force thy daughters from me. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Before our brethren discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. And Laban went into Jacob's tent, to Leah's tent, into the two maidservants' tents. He didn't find them. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture and sat on them. And Laban searched all the tent, but didn't find them. And she said to her father, let it not displease my lord, that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. She had PMS or whatever. And he searched, but found not the images. And Jacob was wroth and chode with Laban. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my trespass? What is my sin, that you so hotly pursued after me? Because you've searched all my stuff, and what have you found of all thy household stuff? Set it here, let me see it, before my brethren and thy brethren, that they may judge between us both. This 20 years have I been with you, and your ewes and your she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of your flock I have not eaten. Why? Because God blessed him. That which is torn of beast I brought not to thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night. Thus I was in the day, the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus I've been 20 years in your house, and I served you 14 years for your daughters, and 6 years for your cattle, and you changed my wages 10 times. Except the God of my father, the God of Abram, the fear, the reverence of Isaac had been with me, surely you would have sent me away now empty. God has seen my affliction and the labor of my hands, and rebuked thee yesternight. He told him. And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and these cattle are my cattle, and all that you see is mine. What can I do this day unto these my daughters, or unto their children which they have borne? Now therefore come thou, let's make a covenant, I and thou, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. So they took a stone, set it up for a pillar. This is another one of those stones they set up. So they set up this pillar, offered sacrifice, made that covenant, and then verse 54, Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount, called his brethren to eat bread. They did eat bread, tarried all night in the mount. And early in the morning Laban rose up, kissed his sons and his daughters, blessed them, And Laban departed and returned unto his place. Wow. So one problem solved, but one to go. Jacob had dealt with Laban. Remember, God told him to go. Now he needs to deal with Esau. But look what God does to reassure him. Genesis 32, verse 1. And Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's host." And he called the name of that place Mahanaim. Well, how do you think that made him feel when he saw that? Well, God's defense is here. I'm worried about Esau, but look what God's telling me. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother into the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, "Thus shall ye speak to my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob said thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed there until now. And I have oxen and asses and flocks, and men servants and women servants, and I have sent to tell my Lord that I might find grace in thy sight." So he's talking to Esau like that. And the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We've come to thy brother Esau, and also he comes to meet thee with 400 men with him." Hoo-hoo! And then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed. 400 men. And he divided the people that was with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels, into 2 bands, and said, well, if Esau come to one company and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape. And Jacob said, "O God of my father Abraham, the God of my father Isaac, the Lord which says to me, Return to thy country and to thy kindred, and I will deal well with thee. I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. For with my staff I passed over this Jordan, and now I am become 2 bands. Deliver, I pray thee, from the hand of my brother, and from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he will come and smite me, and the mother with the children. As thou saidst, I will surely do thee good, make thy seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for a multitude." And he lodged there that night, and took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother, 200 she-goats, and 20 he-goats, 200 ewes, and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 kine, 10 bulls, 20 she-asses, and 10 foals. Just a whole herd. He delivered them into the hand of his servants. Every drove by themselves, and said unto his servants, "Pass over before me, and put a space between drove and drove." And he commanded the foremost, saying, "When Esau my brother meets thee and asks thee, saying, Who are you? And where are you going? And who are these before you? Then thou shalt say, They be thy servant Jacob's, and it is a present sent to my lord Esau. And behold, he is behind us." And he commanded the second and the third and all that followed the droves, saying, "On this matter shall you speak unto Esau when you find him. And you say, Moreover, behold, thy servant Jacob is behind us, for he said, I will appease him with the present that goes before me, and afterward I will see his face. Peradventure he will accept of me." So went the present over before him, and himself lodged that night in the company. And he rose up that night, took his 2 wives, and his 2 women servants, and the 11 sons, and passed over the ford Jabbok. And he took them and sent them over the brook, and sent over that he had. So Jacob was prepared for the worst, divided them into 2 troops. But then something extraordinary occurred. Genesis 32:24. Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, The hollow of Jacob's thigh then was out of joint as he wrestled with him. Well, that was extremely painful. And he said, "Let me go, for the day breaks." And Jacob said, "I won't let you go except you bless me." Because this was an angel wrestling with him. And he said, "I ain't going to let you go until you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." And the angel said, "Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast you power with God and with men, and have prevailed." And Jacob asked him, "Tell me, what's your name?" And he said, "What are you asking my name for?" And he blessed him there. Now, from this we see more about Jacob and his spiritual perception, because he had been promised Abraham's promise and Abraham's covenant. He also had made a vow to fulfill if God brought him back home in peace. And an angel met him, and he was all alone and wrestled with him. And Jacob said, "I'm not going to let you go except you bless me," because he wanted more. And he wouldn't let go till he got it. Even after he was injured, he wouldn't let go. Now, just think. Could anyone who was a crook wrestle with an angel? I don't think so. He knew that when God blesses, those words are binding, and he needed all the help he could get to fulfill his dreams, cure his fears, and meet his destiny of Abraham's promise and covenant. And he was determined to get as much as he could. Israel. Some people say it means ruling with God. Gesenius says it means fighter or soldier of God. Brown Driver Briggs says, "Let God contend or persevere." Well, the angel said, "You are a prince who have power with God and with men and have prevailed." So he indeed was driven to persevere, to prevail, to contend for God, Israel. I realized this later. Just like Abraham's new name was an encouragement, Israel's new name was a vindication. Why? Why wrestling? Jacob had been wrestling his whole life. He even was wrestling in his mother's womb. His whole life had been a struggle against evil. Since he was an ancestor in the Christ line, he had a target on his back. Well, just like his grandfather Abraham, he never gave in and he never gave up on the family business. Rotherham translates verse 28 as, quote, "For you have contended with God and with men, and hast prevailed." Israel, God's contender, God's winner. This new name was to propel him through the rest of his life to fulfill his destiny, taking steps to found a nation of the same name and legacy. Genesis 33:1. And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men. And he had divided the children unto Leah and unto Rachel and unto the two handmaids. And he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. And he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times, until he came near his brother. And Esau ran to meet him, and embraced him, and fell on his neck, and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw the women and the children, and said, "Who are these with you?" And he said, "The children which God hath graciously given thy servant." And the handmaids came near, and their children, and they bowed themselves, and Leah also, with her children, and came near and bowed themselves. And after that came Joseph near and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. And he said, what means all this drove which I met, all those animals? And he said, these are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. And Esau said, I have enough, my brother, keep that thou hast unto thyself. And Jacob said, no, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in your sight, receive my present at my hand, for therefore I have seen your face, as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath thus dealt graciously with me, and because I too have enough. And he urged him, and he took it. This is all the culture that's at work there. He called him brother, and they kissed him, and he hugged him, and he saw all the children, and then they did that constraining ceremony with the gift. No, I don't want it. No, you take it, please. Please, I have enough. They both said, I have enough. He and Esau made peace, just what he was believing for. Genesis 33:16. So Esau returned that day on his way unto Seir. Jacob journeyed up to Succoth, built him a house, made booths for his cattle, and therefore the name of the place is called Succoth, booths. And Jacob came to Shalem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, and pitched his tent before the city. And he bought a parcel of a field where he spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. So, now the promise and the covenant to Abraham is taking form as prophesied. Jacob is back home in peace with his family, and all is well. This is God-involved history. And we don't take Esau's word for who Jacob was. We take God's word. Bless you.